Okay, more about Joseph Campbell. So, things to know about Joseph Campbell. His theory, his book is called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. He's not actually an anthropologist, although this piece of work is cultural anthropology. I don't know why I took my glasses out there. He was a literature professor at Sarah Lawrence. So his background was actually in comp lit, and he decided to start doing anthropology, and he was doing comparative folklore and mythology. So these are not really things that were within his realm of academic training. Um, so here's the thing: is he comes up with this. He sort of preforms this idea, and a lot of it is traditionally a Judeo-Christian form. One person that you can map the hero's journey onto pretty clearly is Jesus. Um, so then he goes out and he sort of cherry picks the stories that match up with this, and he's like, look, see, it's everywhere. And the thing is, like, if somebody tells you like that the number 23 is cosmically important, you will start seeing you'll start seeing cosmic things. You start noticing the number 23 anywhere. You have an anticipatory set, and you're going out into the world, and your consciousness is sort of pre-trained to find this. So arguably, that is the first problem with the hero's journey and with Joseph Campbell and the monomyth, is that he decides that this is a story. He goes out looking for it, and surprise, he finds it. The second problem is that it's pretty Western centric. It's Judeo Christian centric, and he doesn't stray really far from that. He gets into some like Babylonian myths, but he's super cherry picky around Eastern mythologies and African mythologies. If they don't match up, he has a tendency to just sort of not find those stories. Which is, he's not the first anthropologist to not find those stories, but I feel like we can call him out on that. Another structural problem with it: if it is in fact a monomyth, if it's the story that underlies all stories, then it doesn't really tell us anything interesting. Like, all you're doing, if you believe this, if this is the only story that's being told, then all you can really do is like look at a story and label the parts of it. So it's non-predictive. It's not. It can be constructive. I mean, George Lucas read Joseph Campbell's books and was like, "Oh, I'm going to write a story um, based on that format," and came up with Star Wars. Um, so it can be generative. You can, and I know a lot of writers who will sit down and be like, "Okay, well, I need to figure out my plot according to the hero's journey." You don't have to do that, but it's a thing. Um, but what I'm saying is that as a theory, it doesn't predict anything. It doesn't tell us anything new about the world. It just like gives us a set of labels to put on things, which um, is not super helpful. Um, but the big thing is that it's not the only story, um, and saying that it's the only story, that it's the one valid story form, means that if things fall outside of that, um, that they are somehow not stories, or that they're not as good. Um, and built into that problem is, in addition to being highly influenced by Judeo-Christian ethics and Judeo-Christian narrative, it's a highly male-centric and privileged narrative form. The whole idea of heroism, of like going out on the quest, is a very bro thing to do. Which is not to say that women can't, obviously, but the act of it is like mapped onto to traditionally male values and denigrates traditionally female values. And even if we want to discard that, it it valorizes certain values and denigrates others. And I think the big ones that I want to call attention to, I mean, one is I talked in the last one about that moment of refusal of the call. And refusal of the call comes down to generally fear or obligation. And what what's built into that is the idea that um, that obligation is a bad thing, and that community is a bad thing. The community and your home or the people around you, that's annoying. The people around you are something that you have to escape or move past. Um, and it's sort of mapped onto the like growing up and leaving home thing. But in these stories, you're leaving not just your immediate nuclear home. You're you're leaving your community, and you're leaving your community behind. Ideally, you're bringing back some sort of one of the versions of these is bringing back the elixir. You're bringing back spiritual knowledge or objects that are going to help your community, but you are abandoning them, and you're leaving aside your sort of your community bonds. And I don't know that that's something that should be universally valorized, or that we should say that that is the right thing to do, and that staying within your community is always a sort of form of weakness. It's the refusal of the call. Um, the other thing is that you will probably have noticed in um, in the description that it constantly has women standing on the sidelines as markers. There's a mother left behind. There's often a wife or future wife returned to. In between, there's the mystical marriage of meeting the goddess, and there's the temptress, which and the goddess here represents a sort of joining of, like I said, a mystical marriage, a joining with the spiritual, and temptress always represents the sort of threat of the physical and the threat of desire. And this is another thing that I'm going to tag is that like the the idea that physical desire is an inherently bad thing that has to be overcome, and that it is in the form of a woman, and the woman needs to be shunned. If you look at classical literature, these are you have your Circe, your Dido, like bad things happen to the temptress who represents carnality and physicality. Um, so those are sort of my big gripes with it. There are other problems with Campbell and his sort of politics, particularly around uh, anti-Semitism. But I just don't think it's necessarily a useful theory. Um, I think it's loaded with a lot of stuff that drags stories down and means that we have to repeat the same stories over and over again, and that those stories and then it privileges the stories of males and males who have the ability and willingness to leave their community. Um, and I think there are other ways that we can tell stories, and I think Charlie Jane Anders is playing outside of that realm. Um, Although certainly she is taking elements of the hero's journey, but I think we want to look at what she's doing that is different, and the one of the lenses that I want to use to talk about that is an essay by Ursula K. Le Guin called The Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction, and I'm going to talk about that in the next lecture. So that is it for describing and slightly critiquing, or actually critiquing Joseph Campbell and the idea of the monomyth or the hero's journey.